On today's episode of Locked On Wild, I'm in the guest chair as the Locked On Avalanche fellas want the inside scoop on where the Minnesota Wild are at and where they're trying to get to this season.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Avalanche and Locked On Wild podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for tuning in and making it your first listen of the day from Locked On Avalanche. I am Chris Maselli. With me, as always, Mr. Shaggy Von Doom, Kyle Sullivan, like we said in the opening, joining us from the Minnesota Wild, Locked On Wild podcast. Our good friend, Mr. Seth Topol, raising the roof down there. Or is he just keeping us up? Is he holding us up from the way that the camera's set up? Yeah. Seth, always love having you on, sir. It's been an interesting offseason, as it has for most teams. Wild are nothing different. So how are things going so far? Just give us the bird's eye view. Do you like the things that they've done? We'll get to the draft in a minute because I think that's maybe the highlight. But just overall, last year compared to early returns on where they're heading into next year, you liking it?
Well, I'm going to use one of your guys' bits to kind of tell my mood as to where the Minnesota Wild are at right now. I'm going to give you a sound check.
Yes.
Hey.
Yes.
So,
let's do it.
Here's what I'm going with. Stuck in the middle with you.
Love it.
This is
okay.
Awesome.
And I got to tell you, like, it's funny because we knew going into this past season with what was going on with Zach Parise and Ryan Suter's contracts and the buyouts, that it was going to be tough. It's just going to be tough for this team to contend on a level that you would like them to. Now, to the Minnesota Wild's credit, a couple of years ago, they defied expectations. They had a very, very good season, 53 wins, 113 points. But how'd that go in the playoffs? Not great. And the constraints just get higher and higher over these last couple of seasons to where it's just going to be tough because you've got all these guys that you've got a good core that has been built, but there needs to be work done on kind of that supplementary group of players to help out the likes of Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson-Ek, guys like that. Those are your core guys. That's a good group. But you need work in some of those other areas, and what has become a very glaring need for this team over the last two seasons for sure is somebody that can step into that top six and fill one of those wing spots. Last year was an absolute black hole for the Minnesota Wild on their second line wing spot. But you would think that you would want to try to identify somebody in your prospect group, right, that could develop into that spot, then lock them in to part of your core.
Yeah.
Draft and develop, right? Well, over the last couple of seasons, it feels like the Wild have kind of done things in reverse, where they're getting all of these good, like, veteran presences, these, complementary pieces that maybe aren't like your first or second options, but can bring good veteran presence, veteran bite. And now we're locking those guys in like they're top six performers. You're locking those guys into those spots. And now we're in this gridlock between a good prospect core. Like, it's amazing how much work Judd Brackett has done to revamp that whole thing in the last couple of seasons. We're now in a spot for this year where it feels like there is a true power struggle between these veteran guys that have been brought in to kind of lead this group and the prospects that should be getting the playing time when they are ready for it. A lot of us believe that they are indeed ready for it. And so now you're in this final year of these constraints where it's going to be where you have just under $15 million in dead cap. But it feels like you're going this way into the final year of that, as opposed to going like this.
Right.
If I was GM these last couple of seasons, it would have been, let's identify the guys we can't lose and fill with some of these prospects and see if we can get let's see if we can find somebody like a Danila Yurov to be able to step in and be a top line guy that you then lock in, a la what teams like Dallas, like Colorado, teams do like that, where you prioritize your top 6 and then you can go out at the trade deadline and find somebody to fill a third line role and be a bruiser. Now it feels like we're doing things in reverse, where you've locked in all of those third and fourth line guys. And what are you going to do now for goals, which is really the only thing that matters. Like, you got to score goals to win games.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my assessment of where things are at with this franchise, is that it feels like in this season in which you should be kind of excited about what's coming next, we're kind of going into it like this. And it's all Kirill Kaprizov watch at this point.
Right.
Because next offseason, you can start negotiating his new deal.
Yep. He's going to be up there.
Patient do you think he's going to be if this situation continues to kind of head downhill?
And this is, I'm very interested in the Minnesota Wild situation. You have a very underrated D core. You have it like on paper, really, really sound defense. I really like it. Goalie tandem, not bad at all. Forwards, we'll see. Is this offseason, we'll get into the draft and your pickups in a minute in depth, but with this dead cap crunch that you're under and getting to have Kirill the Thrill on your team, is this a year, this offseason and the draft and everything, do you see Minnesota starting to take an identity from here going through this dead cap? Because honestly, when we faced Minnesota last year, when the Avalanche would go up, you didn't know what version of Minnesota you were going to see at any point in time during the season. And do you see them starting to take an identity with these moves and giving something for Kirill to kind of apply himself to?
That's a great question. And honestly, I wish the answer were different, because so many teams are prioritizing speed and skill while having the ability to play physical when necessary. Like Edmonton and Florida both did that. You know, the thing that I think of when the Wild play the Avalanche is they've got a ton of speed. And it feels like the Wild are prioritizing the physicality and trying to have the option to play with speed when necessary. But here's the rub. Speed is always necessary. Like, you need to have playmakers in your lineup to be able to score goals. And yes, this team may have found something that could work long-term in a top line. But guess what? They didn't have a second line that was capable of scoring when that line got shut down. And so they're doubling down on this identity of being a tough team to play against by being physical, by hitting everything that moves, by having guys that are capable of, you know, strong forechecking and being able to really make guys wear teams down. You can't hit what you can't catch. And so it feels like, and Bill Guerin has said this offseason, the Wild needing to get their identity back as a team that is a pain to play against and is physical and such. I would rather have that as something in the back of your pocket that you can go to if you need to. And I would have my identity be, we are going to tire you guys out by skating circles around you. And you are going to have to defend 2-3 lines worth of guys that can just flat out fly. Good luck.
Yeah.
But you've got one line that is a legitimate threat to score. You've got a second line that could be, depending on who fills the one of the wing spots there. But you have 2 full lines of guys that are not speedy guys that just hit. And so it's a roster that, in my opinion, has been built backwards.
Do you feel that this should have fallen on like Dave Evison, or no? Because I just feel like because he was hired was he hired the year after they did the buyouts, or that same year? It was around then, wasn't it?
It was around that same time. Like it felt. I think all of that happened at about the time that Bruce Boudreau was shown the door.
Yeah.
And it might have been that Dean Evison came first, and then, if I remember correctly, I think Dean Evison came in first, and then you had the buyouts. Shortly thereafter.
So, I mean, regardless, I mean, it happened around that time.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, was it warranted? Should it have happened? Did they come down on him too much and kind of put blame on him too? Like, what was the talking points in Minnesota Wild country about that? Did people want him fired? Were people saying like, hey, it's not his fault? And despite all of it, I think the Wild have done pretty good navigating this thing. I understand completely what you're saying. And, they're not going where we want them to go, but they're holding their head above water. They're competitive. They're not bottom dwellers during all of this. And they show them the door when kind of right around the corner. You just got to get through this year and you have relief. And they didn't want to do that. They let them go.
It's funny because I don't think anybody would have faulted the Minnesota Wild for, once Parise and Suter were bought out, saying we know it's going to be tough to compete with these constraints. And on the buyout standpoint itself, Zach Parise retired before his original contract was done, so that was the correct decision to make. Ryan Suter's on his third team since, having signed with the St. Louis Blues here recently. So he's been bought out. He's been bought out twice.
Yep.
So buying those two guys out was the correct call. I think the decision to insist that the team is still like Stanley Cup caliber, as opposed to just being honest and saying, we're going to use this opportunity to try to develop our next core. Like, if you would have taken prospects in your system, and I know a lot of these prospects have just been recent picks that Judd Brackett has nailed, as we'll talk about with Zeev Buium here in a little bit. But I feel like, especially over these last 2 years, you could have gone into the situation in which your cap expands and you've got $15 million to spend. You could have gone into that situation and said, well, we know this prospect will hit. We know this prospect is going to hit. We know this guy's going to hit. We have $15 million to play with, and we need to go find, maybe at that point you need to go find a third line guy. So then you can go spend that money and you can do it. You can say 1 or 2 year deal. Here you go. But now it's like the percentage of hit is much smaller because you're looking for one of those prospects to be like at the minimum, second line scoring guy with top line upside. It's like you could have, I just feel like the process could have been done a little different way.
Yeah.
And led to a situation where you're like, hey, we have $15 million to spend. We know exactly what we need. Where now it's like, well, we need this, we need this, we need this. And the other thing too is, with some of these extensions that have been handed out, some of that money has already been spent. And you've got a Brock Faber extension coming up. That's going to be $7 to $8 million a season. That'll eat into that. Some of those prospects on entry-level contracts, including Jesper Wallstedt, who you expect to be the goalie of the future. He's going to have a new deal coming up. Marco Rossi's due for a new deal. And this happens to every team, but it feels like now you are using that buyout money to pay for these extensions, and you still have a lot of the same areas in the lineup that need to be addressed.
All right. Well, let's talk about what they did at the draft. I know there's some Colorado faithful that maybe are not too pleased with the Minnesota Wild in getting. It's crazy to say it could be the steal of the draft, but it could be based on where people thought he was going to go and where he actually went. So we will talk about the Wild pickup of Zeev Buium here in a minute, right after the break. All right, let's hear from eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what brings your ride or die alive, keeps your ride or die alive, excuse me. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you are into speed, power, or style, we have a name for that, Seth. What is it called?
Close your ears, Seth. It is the Nathan McKinnon trilogy.
That is right. eBay Motors has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home the win. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, let's talk about the draft. Did you attend it or no?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Recent circumstances led to me changing my plans.
You were going to?
I was planning to. I was planning to. I didn't think it would be financially responsible in the midst of a job hunt.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Man, the Wild pulled a wild card here. And Zeev Buium from University of Denver falls to them at 13, correct?
Was it 12?
12. Okay. Well, did they moved up one?
They moved up one spot.
That's what it was. That's what it was. Okay. You were hilarious on Twitter because you were just, I could tell you didn't want to throw out too much into the atmosphere to jinx anything, but you were you just, every pick that went by, you were like, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. I can't believe this. And then Minnesota moves up one, and you're like, well, there it goes. They draft it. They draft Zeev Buium, phenomenal defender out of University of Denver. And people are saying it, man. Like this is the pick where when you do your redrafts 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people are going to be like, yeah, Celebrini is probably still going to be at number one, but just law of averages, I guess. Not all these guys 1 through 11 are superstars. He could be, and he's going to be way up that draft board when you do some redrafts. Go back to, I know it was only it was not that long ago, but go back to then and your feelings, your emotions, and what this guy is going to bring to this team.
I'm glad you talked about the Twitter experience for me, because I've never live tweeted a heart attack before. And it was unreal, because the first thing that popped into my head is 4 or 5 years down the road, that'll be your top D pairing of Zeev Buium and Brock Faber. And I was salivating at the possibility of that. But the reason that I think he fell is the reason that Philadelphia didn't pick him at 12. And Danny Briere was pretty blunt in his reasoning after the fact, in that just felt like Buium was a little too small for their liking. And let's be honest here. He's 5'11", so it's not like he's, sub 6 foot is technically small, but I feel like in Buium's case, that was one guy where that should not have factored in as much as it did. But Briere basically said, like, we've got this guy, who all are kind of similar builds. And so that this just wasn't something that they prioritized, which I guess, thank you for that.
Yeah.
But the thing that was crazy too is there was all this steam during the drafts, Rutger McGroarty being available for the right price. And from what Michael Russo said, had Buium not been there, the Wild were pretty set on trading for Rutger McGroarty with the 13th pick. So the fact that Zeev slid, and I think in a lot of mocks, he was going to Utah. Like, that was kind of the range in that 5-6-ish range.
Yeah,
was where he was going.
I kept hearing if he's there when the Devils pick, there's no way they're passing on.
Yeah,
and the Devils went defense. Actually, wasn't it like 4 out of 5 picks before him went D?
Yeah,
so
that was
like just
a
his
real
run of defenders, and you would think that he would have been one of them, and he was the last one of all of them. Crazy.
That was the biggest sweat of the whole thing, because my draft crush, Anton Salayev, I think is who actually the Devils ended up taking.
Yeah.
I was just enamored with the size and the ability to skate, but it is truly one of those rare instances in which it seems like everything just lined up perfect. Like, you have Utah take Tiji Ginla, and at that point, when they took Tiji Ginla and the Kraken followed it up, because when Ginla went off the board, I was like, okay, Buium's going to Seattle, like, done deal, set it, forget it. When they took Berkeley Catton, I was like, this might actually happen. Like, this might actually fall into place. And then, like you said, there was that run on defensemen, and it's just sweating every single one of them. And when it got to 12, I think there were a couple of other teams that called Philly with interest.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Guerin just said, let's not mess this up. Let's just go get our guy. And the Wild are certainly fortunate that it worked out the way that it did, but I'm just so impressed with the pedigree that he is going to bring to the table. A guy who was one of the most standout players on a really, really good Denver team.
Yeah.
And he's going to get the opportunity to do it again. Just a wizard with the puck, great offensively, a bulldog. I honestly, it was probably one of the players that I expected would be least there for the Minnesota Wild. So the fact that all of my reaction was genuine surprise is because there was no scenario that I played out that had him going to the Wild at that spot.
Let's cut the crap right here. The only reason you guys went and drafted him is because we got Ben Myers, your golden gopher, so you had to go after a pioneer.
This was an eye for an eye, absolutely.
I know how this goes.
Totally the same. We're drafted one of the best defenders in the draft to an undrafted senior. Totally the same.
That's what it is.
Yeah. We had a lot of questions on subtext as we threw that out, telling people that you were going to be on with, and almost all of them were about anger directed towards the Minnesota Wild. You mentioned Brock Faber, and what I like about you, Seth, is you'll be a straight shooter with this question. He had my vote for a Calder. I feel like he should have won that. And I want to ask you, and I will not say that you are a homer if you feel like he generally should have won the Calder. What say you? Do you think it should have been him, or hey, we're talking about one of the greatest that could grow up and be one of the greatest in the league, and they want to have him have it and all that whole mindset. What do you think?
I think it should have been Faber. Like, you just look at the body of work, and yes, Connor Bedard had more goals. He had more points. He was a top line guy for Chicago the whole season. I'm not going to take credit away from him for that, but scoring was what he brought to the table. He wasn't tasked with winning a critical faceoff late in a game. He wasn't tasked with trying to kill a penalty late in a game. And maybe that's not fair to throw all of that at him. But when I compare the two players, I look at a couple of things. The Minnesota Wild had injuries to Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin this season. Brock Faber, coming in as a rookie, filled in as number one pairing defenseman, number one power play quarterback, number one penalty kill defenseman. He played in overtime. He had a run of 5 straight games where he played 30-plus minutes. He did all of that while nearly setting a record for Minnesota Wild points by a defenseman, let alone a rookie. And he played the final 2 months of the season with broken ribs, and we didn't even hear about it until after the season was done. And he just got up every single day and did his business. If he was going to be playing first pairing, if he was going to be playing third pairing, it didn't matter. He was going to excel at it. And honestly, I know a lot of people would say, if you subtract Kirill Kaprizov, the Wild are a mess. I would say if you subtract Joel Eriksson-Ek, the Wild are a mess. If the Wild would not have had Brock Faber this season to stabilize that D-core and all of the injuries that were suffered there, they would have picked in the top 3. And so you tell me which player is more valuable to their team, because that's what it is. It's not points. It's more value to your team. You tell me which player meant more to their team. Chicago would have been bad with or without Bedard.
Exactly.
Chicago would have struggled to score goals, and they did struggle to score goals without Connor Bedard. But guess what? They struggled to score with him too. I truly believe if Brock Faber did not have the type of season that he did, that the Minnesota Wild would have been infinitely worse than they were, because he just stepped in and filled every hole that the team needed to have filled. If that's not a guy that should win the Calder, I don't know what to tell you.
I know, man. I kind of feel like it was just popularity, name recognition contests this year.
You know, and I was also voting for Faber there, and I kind of like that he didn't win. Now this is a challenge. Like, you know that this is going to be a race for the rest of their careers. So I kind of look at this for Faber to be challenged by this and have an even better year next year, where this is always going to be looked back at, almost like Taylor Hall winning the Hart with Nathan McKinnon, where you're going to look back and say, you know, he did win it this year, but Faber has had the better career. And I feel like this is the beginning of that beautiful story.
Are you going on record saying Brock Faber's going to have a better career than Connor Bedard?
You know what? I honestly, when you're watching both of the bodies of work,
it's tough. They're different positions, but okay.
I'm curious to see what Chicago puts around them, because again, Minnesota has a sneaky good team. Even though with everything around it, I like Faber's situation and what Minnesota can do, contrary to what Chicago, they're not really good at putting a team together other than the cup years that we saw almost a decade ago.
Well,
I'm kind of leaning Faber might actually have the better career when everything is said and done, because Bedard, yes, I know he's flashy and he does all this and he's good for like a 5-second like Twitter clip, but I like Faber's game beginning to end, no matter what you ask him to do.
I mean, they got 20 years to build a team around him, so I think I would hope they'll be able to. I mean, and I think we're splitting hairs here. I think both these guys are going to have phenomenal careers, and but I liked what Faber did, and I think, you know, the award was Bedard's before he even hit the ice. Didn't matter. All he had to do was be out there and do something. And he did. I mean, he got injured for a little bit, but you could even include that if you want to. Like Faber, how many games did he play last year? I don't know if you know that.
All 82.
All of them. There you go. There you go. That's just another feather in the cap. So crazy.
And you know, another fun fact too. Before this season, Brock Faber had never quarterbacked a power play.
Wow. You are asked, what's that?
You'd have no idea.
Yeah, you would have no idea watching him to play this year.
Wow. I mean, this just adds to it. Come on.
Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
We got Yakov Trenin over there on the rundown. You guys signed him. Had a hot second with the Avalanche, and I really liked what he brought. Didn't really think that they were going to be able to resign him. Avs are in cap restraints right now, so I didn't really think it was going to happen. Goes to Minnesota. We had some questions from our subtext people on that as well. Eric just wanted to ask what you think about that. Is it too much for Yakov Trenin? 3.5 over 4 years, I believe it is.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it's probably a year too many. And I go back and forth with the dollar amount because the cap continues to rise and these contracts that guys are getting. I don't have as much issue with the AAV as I do with the years.
Okay.
But here's the problem too, is like the Wild were a soft team to play against down the stretch, after Pat Maroon and Brandon Duhaime were traded. So some of that was by, self-infliction.
Mm-hmm.
And so by itself, I don't mind the Yakov Trenin signing, because I think of the guys that you look at, I think he can help you, especially on the penalty kill. Penalty kill for the Wild is atrocious this past season. And so this is kind of what I was talking about before is, you use free agency or trades to grab those bottom six guys that you kind of need to be the last piece of the puzzle. But the Wild have done that like 6 times. And so now you have these guys that all kind of do similar things. You've got Marcus Foligno, you've got Yakov Trenin, you've got Ryan Hartman, you've got Freddie Gaudreau, you've got, you got all these guys that are essentially kind of carbon copies of each other. And so because of all of those other moves, now having Trenin be like the last one, it just is kind of an eye roll at this point. Like, it's like, well, are you going to move somebody off the roster that doesn't do what Trenin does? If that happens, then I'm going to feel way better about it. And again, I think Yakov Trenin, I think he's a good ad, but it's just within the scope of everything that the Wild have done from a contract perspective over the last couple of seasons. It's just another one of those types of guys being added to the mix. And so that's kind of, it's very one side of the coin and the other for me, just because of what's happened over the last couple of seasons with the Wild too.
And when it comes to looking at this contract, don't look back at what he provided in Nashville and Colorado, because this is a different value. What his game plan and his play style, it's perfect for what Minnesota is trying to do right now. So that 3.5, when everything's all said and done, it might be one of your better looking contracts, because he's going to be a motor. He's going to be physical. He's going to be disruptive. And you're not paying out the face for a player like him. Like playing on Colorado last year, everything he did was great. He was serviceable, but that paying 3.5 for what he provides Colorado just doesn't really match up. But for Minnesota, this is perfect.
Yeah. And it, as some of these guys, because even though they've handed out some of the most trade protection in the entire league, and trust me, I actually went and charted it for every single team. That's where we're at in the offseason. But it's like, if they do move, like one guy that I really just would like to see get a new opportunity, and maybe he does, if Dean Evison lands in Columbus, is Freddie Gaudreau. Like, I know he was hurt. I just was never a fan of giving a guy like that, who put 2 years together as very clearly the third option on a line. I was never in favor of giving a guy like that a 5-year deal.
Yeah.
That's just not good business. But, some of this too that I've been thinking about is, at some point with where Minnesota is at, a lot of times that's just what you have to give somebody to get them to sign with you. Like, if Trenin was a free agent, would he have taken a 1 or 2 year deal to go to Nashville? Just as a generic free agent. I know he played there before.
Mm-hmm.
Would he have taken a 1 or 2 year deal to go play with Nashville and be part of that contending team? Would he do that for Dallas? Would he do that for Colorado? Probably. But knowing that it's going to be at least another year before Minnesota is in serious contention, probably 2, you gotta give players a little bit above to convince them to come play for you. And it seems like a lot of that has been done within the last 18 months. There have been a lot of those, like, we want you to stick around, we're going to overpay to do it. And I just was like, was it worth it was it worth it when it's all said and done to give all those no move and no trade protections to get guys to commit to staying. Now, if Bill Guerin can move those guys over the next couple of seasons to make room for some of these promising prospects, then I just say, well, turns out I was wrong. But at this point, it's like you've created a lot of immovability on this roster. And it's just until these prospects crack the lineup, it's tough to see spots for them at this point.
See how this all breaks out for the Wild. It's an interesting team. Very interesting team. There's an interesting question that we got from one of our sub-texters, Zach. Why does Kaprizov cut the tongues off of his skates? I didn't know that he did that.
That's a great question. I noticed that he does that, and I don't know if it comes down to comfort.
That's what I was just gonna say. It's gotta be,
It's gotta be it's either something he has done at every level and it's just habit at this point, or superstition, or it comes down to a comfort thing for him.
My guess is when you're young and you're breaking in a new set of skates, the tongue can leave right on that instep, not in the instep where you're, what is that part of your body where your leg and then your foot goes that way? So right there, that
I'm a podcast, not a podiatrist.
I know, right? Yeah. It can get, it can get raw. It can get, it rubs against that and gets uncomfortable. Maybe when he was a kid, he just got it off.
Yeah.
And he's just done it ever since. Guys have quirks. Maybe that's it. Who knows?
It's like Darcy Kemper not wearing socks in his skates. It's like
Darcy Kemper's equipment. It's a whole different podcast.
Yeah.
They're just like guys in hockey are just wired different.
Yeah, that one I don't get. And I know there's a couple guys that do that, but man,
no chance. No chance.
You gotta have some Flintstone feet if you're doing that. So all right. So what do we I know I loved that you brought up the sound check in the very beginning. Is that what the expectation is for next season? Somewhere in the middle?
Yes.
Will you maybe surprise some people and be in the mix for a wild card spot and maybe just miss it? Or do you feel like, hey, maybe you go on a Nashville Predators run and gain a spot? Like where are we here with the Wild early predictions or thoughts for next year?
I see two potential outcomes to this. Is that this lineup has finally, and I'm sure some of the listeners are hearing this and saying, boy, somebody tell this guy to go outside and touch grass. Like, what's going on here? But I see this going two ways, because a lot of what is contingent on Minnesota being good this year is health and players who had down seasons last year not doing it again. Those are not like, betting on everybody being healthy is just never a great bet to make. You're going to sustain injuries every season. And so betting on that to be one of the reasons that you bounce back, not a great bet. Here's where things can change though, because we have a bunch of prospects, the Minnesota Wild do, that are knocking on the door. So either the Minnesota Wild will have players that some of these vets that don't live up to the expectations that they have, or guys will get hurt. If the prospects come in and fill those spots and impress, this could be a team. Like if somebody comes in and takes that second line spot and impresses and runs with it, just takes it and runs with it, all of a sudden that's a potential issue that has been taken care of. Now you've got a couple of lines that can score, and it takes a little pressure off Kirill and the top line. If not, carbon copy of last year. Maybe not as disastrous of a start and a coach firing and all that, but it's going to be a team that's going to come a few points short of a postseason spot. The key is the youth. The key is going to be the youth for this Minnesota Wild team. If they get opportunities to show what they can do and they take them and run with them, this Wild team's got a lot of talent in their farm system. There just aren't a lot of spots on the roster right now. And so this feels very much, like I said, there's this kind of a gridlock for this Wild team this season. I would imagine, and not making the postseason is not a bad thing in my opinion, because not making the postseason 2 years in a row is going to prompt some massive changes. And so that could be a situation where you go to guys and you ask them to waive their trade protections and you trade them either at the deadline or in the offseason. And then you got some prospects that can step in and take those spots.
Sure.
So for me, it's all about evaluation this year.
Yeah.
As for postseason, I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Like you said, not the worst thing in the world to miss out. Yeah. No, that's a good way to look at it. So, all right, man. By the way, weird seeing Zach Parise in a Avs uniform.
I never got used to it for a second. Like the moment I saw him in those colors, and Brandon Duhaime too. Like,
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
having had a chance to interact with him as much as I did over the course of his Minnesota Wild career with a couple of interviews on the show, seeing him in those Avs colors, never got used to it.
Yeah. Where did he go? Did he sign?
Washington.
Yeah.
Was it Washington? Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
Got a 2-year deal with the Caps. So I'm going to see if I can't circle back and see how he's doing in the nation's capital.
I didn't know that. I can't check Cap Friendly. I had no idea he went to the Caps. I didn't know. All right, sir. Thank you again always for doing these crossovers. You're always a joy to have on and talk. I'm sure we will do this around the season, before the season starts, kind of get a final input on what to expect, or shortly after the season starts. I don't know. Actually, Kyle, when we were the schedule, it's kind of spaced out nicely. How the Avalanche and Wild. It's not just like, hey, within 2 weeks all their games are done. I think it's spaced out over like 3 months where they're playing. So
that happened with like 4 teams that the Wild played this last year. I know Calgary was one of them where they played like 4 times in a 6-game span. It's like, horrible. Okay, we got to stop with that.
Terrible.
So
terrible.
Yeah, we'll definitely check in, because I'm gonna pull a little bit of inspiration from you guys and do kind of a road trip
nice.
with the other Locked On hosts for August. So we'll definitely put that into motion.
All right, man. Throw out where people can follow you.
You can follow me on X at Seth TOUPS. I handle Minnesota sports fandom, as you would expect. So there's a lot of that, but then you can follow the show at Locked On Wild, all the socials. We got the nice, easy at Locked On Wild for all of them. So make sure to stay tuned. And, I'm just trying to kind of keep things fresh through the off season. So I've been doing a lot of looks back at different drafts, rankings, all sorts of those little fun off season bits to just keep things kind of fresh in the hopper.
You do a lot. You do. You put a lot up on your channel. So if you want content, Wild content, Seth's the guy to go to. So thanks again, man. Really appreciate it. He is Seth Topol from Locked On Wild. I'm at Chris Maselli with Shaggy Von Doom, Kyle Sullivan from Locked On Avalanche. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and making it your first listen of the day.